The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from New York, Mr. Langworthy, for yielding the customary 30 minutes, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, here we are, 6 weeks into a new Congress, and the Republican majority has yet to bring substantive, serious legislation to the floor that does anything to address the serious issues confronting our great nation. Instead, we've seen Republican leadership buckle under, time and again, to the demands of a right-wing minority that seems more interested in stoking controversy and conspiracy theories than crafting actual legislation or governing. Instead of delivering for the American people, we've seen precious time and taxpayer dollars wasted in power struggles and political stunts rather than doing the people's business. True to that pattern, today's rule provides for the consideration of 3 deeply problematic measures that further the objectives of that extremist minority, measures that stoke division, that undermine government institutions, and that threaten fundamental American freedoms when they don't align with the radical right's ideology. By caving to these fringe forces, Republican leadership is squandering precious time and taxpayer dollars that would be better spent working together on the issues most Americans want us to address: lowering prices, addressing housing, healthcare, and education needs, making our communities safer, and protecting our planet. The first 2 resolutions under consideration today would nullify legislation recently passed by the democratically elected D.C. Council, and in the process would undermine the fundamental right of citizens of Washington, D.C. to political self-determination. H.J. Res. 24 would overrule the Local Resident Voting Rights Act, which was recently passed by the D.C. Council. With this measure, the citizens of D.C. decided to join other municipalities around the country in allowing non-citizen residents to vote in local D.C. elections. H.J. Res. 26 would nullify the Revised Criminal Code Act, the RCCA, which reformed D.C.'s criminal code. That code has not been comprehensively revised since it was first enacted in 1901. The American people expect their members of Congress to prioritize their most pressing kitchen table issues, but instead of focusing on lowering costs or creating better-paying jobs, we're here today to interfere with legislation duly enacted by the citizens of D.C. and their government. Not only is that not what our constituents sent us to do, it's distinctly anti-democratic to substitute our policy judgment for the local policy judgment of D.C.'s elected officials. The nearly 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia, a majority of whom are Black and brown, are worthy and capable of self-government. Instead of seeking to undo the work of that democratically elected body, we should be holding hearings and considering whether it is finally time to address the issue of D.C. statehood. And as my colleague Mr. Raskin said in the Rules Committee yesterday, if my Republican colleagues insist on acting as a colonial overseer of the District of Columbia, the least they can do is hear from the people of D.C. Those promoting these resolutions should have called a hearing or at least attempted to engage the D.C. Council and community leaders in some way. If my colleagues think they have the best interests of the people of D.C. at heart, let's hear from the D.C. residents. I believe they've made it quite clear they don't appreciate being made a pawn in national political battles. We owe it to the people of D.C. to enact statehood, not this radical attempt to interfere with the district's democratic process. The subject of these disapproval resolutions, the Revised Criminal Code Act and Local Residents Voting Rights Amendment Act, should be irrelevant. But just so we're clear, let's look at the legislative history of those 2 acts that our colleagues across the aisle want to overturn. Under the D.C. Home Rule Act, which is a federal statute, the democratically elected 13-member D.C. Council is required to enact a new law twice, with at least 13 days intervening between each vote, in order to pass legislation. Legislation passed by the Council and affirmed by the mayor or with a veto override is then transmitted to Congress for a review period. The legislation takes effect at the expiration of the review period unless Congress intervenes by passing a resolution of disapproval. Congress has only overturned duly elected D.C. laws 3 times before the misguided efforts that we're forced to consider today. Now, the D.C. Council passed the Revised Criminal Code Act by votes of 12-0 and 13-0, and while the mayor vetoed it, the council voted to override that veto by a vote of 12-1. The Criminal Code Act is the culmination of a 5-year process to revise and update D.C.'s criminal code, which, as mentioned previously, has not happened since it was first created over a century ago. Everyone in the D.C. legal system, from prosecutors to judges to defense attorneys to scholars, agrees that this revision is long overdue. Our colleagues across the aisle object to the revised criminal code that's been crafted with so much care to meet local conditions because they don't like some sentencing provisions that seek to match up the law with current standards. They posit that harsher penalties would be a greater deterrent to the criminal conduct that they want to target, when in fact the data shows that harsher penalties in some of the states that they represent does not in fact deter that conduct. So think about this. Republican politicians from Georgia and Kentucky and Texas who haven't bothered to take the time to hold a hearing or study this issue have decided to parachute in and dictate to the 700,000 residents of D.C. that they know better than those residents and their elected representatives how to run their city. Can you imagine how those politicians would react if the D.C. City Council tried to tell them how to run the jails in Athens, Georgia, Lexington, Kentucky, or Buffalo, New York? And what is particularly infuriating is that our Republican colleagues claim that they want to block the D.C. law because they want to be tougher on crime. But once again, this is empty rhetoric. Overturning the D.C. criminal code will do nothing to increase public safety in D.C. or anywhere else. As I mentioned at the outset, we're 16 weeks into the new Congress, and the Republican majority has not brought forward any legislation to address crime in America. They won't consider legislation to block the flood of unregulated guns into American communities. They won't ban the weapons of war that take innocent lives in horrifying and predictably regular mass shootings, and they haven't taken any action to address the societal issues that produce violence. The second resolution under consideration would vacate the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act, which the D.C. Council passed by votes of 12-1 and 12-0 after holding hearings and soliciting public comment. This act would allow otherwise qualified D.C. residents who are not U.S. citizens to vote in local D.C. elections. Qualified non-citizen residents could vote in races for mayor, council, attorney general, neighborhood commissioners, school district, and local referenda. Of course, this does not apply to federal elections. Our colleagues are trying to paint this legislation as some radical new idea, but there is nothing in the U.S. Constitution, which I understand was read here on the floor today, so we could check, that prohibits non-citizens from voting in local, state, or federal elections. In fact, there's a long history in the U.S. of non-citizens being allowed to vote in those elections, and they've done so since at least 1704 in what would later become the U.S. At various points, 40 states have permitted non-citizens to vote. Congress only first prohibited non-citizens from voting in federal elections in 1996. And currently, there are at least 15 municipalities that permit non-citizens to vote in local elections. They do so in recognition of the fact that non-citizens who are allowed to vote under such local laws pay a variety of state, local, and federal taxes, and they have an inherent interest in helping to shape policies in the communities where they live. I strongly encourage all of my colleagues to oppose these profoundly undemocratic and paternalistic resolutions. Now, today's rule also provides for consideration of H.R. 185, which would terminate the CDC requirement for proof of COVID-19 vaccination for foreign travelers to enter the U.S. The CDC order was put in place to open the world back up and allow vaccinated foreign travelers to visit the U.S. while keeping our communities safe. Revising or revoking the COVID-19 public health guidance should be at the behest of public health experts with understanding and knowledge of global case trends, up-to-date data, and real-time safety information about emerging infections and COVID-19 epidemiology, not partisan politicians looking to settle political scores or curry favor with the disgraced former president and his base. This bill would upend our current COVID-19 travel protocol and, worse, tie the hands of our public health experts by prohibiting any future order to require COVID-19 vaccinations as a condition of entering the United States. As I said last week, when the majority brought several bills to the floor attacking COVID-19 emergency declarations and vaccines, we shouldn't jeopardize our progress in fighting COVID with political stunts. This is just the latest bill inspired by anti-vax conspiracy theories that has been rushed to the floor uninformed by any hearings or any scientific evidence. It's dangerous to repeatedly mislead the public about the efficacy of these vaccines that are proven to save lives. This bill increases the risk of spreading new variants, just as hospitals and public health infrastructure are trying to rebuild. Once again, an extremist fringe is putting politics over science and undermining public health experts at the expense of the American people, and Republican leadership is letting them get away with it. We need Republican leaders to embrace science and promote the public good, instead of undermining them to score political points. I'm disappointed that my colleagues continue to waste this body's time and taxpayer dollars on frivolous bills and resolutions. Mr. Speaker, the resolution and bill we're considering today does not address the issues we were elected to address for the American people. We've now been in this Congress for over a month and have yet to take up any serious legislation. I hope my colleagues can work in a bipartisan manner to address the problems our constituents sent us here to solve. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.